Hello. Thanks so much for being here. I know your time is incredibly valuable, so I'm honored that you would make it a priority to watch this presentation. In the next hour, I'm going to share some very powerful tools and processes with you. I know they will help you create courageous love in all your important relationships. I'll also let you know how you can take further action if you're interested. First, I just want to give you a little background about me. My name is Stacy Curnow, and I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I was also a nurse midwife for 20 years in a previous career, but I realized that the best part of my day was really sitting with women in their pre or postnatal visits and talking with them about their hopes and dreams and how to navigate the challenging transitions ahead. When I realized that the best part of my day could become my full day as a counselor, I made the switch to a profession in counseling. I've also been married to my husband for over 20 years, and we have a teenage son. So, let us begin with the presentation. First, I want to share a quote that I read many years ago by Joko Beck, who is an American Buddhist nun. So she said, "A relationship is a great gift, not because it makes us happy, it often doesn't, but because any intimate relationship, if we view it as a practice, is the clearest mirror we can find." Again, I read this many years ago, and it always stuck with me because it just felt true. And now I realize that its truth is threefold. So first of all, I was very interested to learn that a study was recently published in the American Journal of Sociology, and it found that over the past decade, numerous studies have found that parents, especially in the United States, report lower levels of happiness than non-parents, despite the fact that they find parenthood meaningful or rewarding in the long run. So ultimately, the study found that the negative effects of parenthood on happiness were entirely explained by the presence or absence of social policies allowing parents to better combine paid work with family obligations. So that makes sense, right? We're all very busy. We're overwhelmed by our workaday lives. We just don't have much time or energy to devote to what, again, I would call the most important relationships in our lives. So again, it would make sense that if we don't have the time and energy to devote to those important relationships, of course, they're not going to bring us happiness. So that's one. Two, it's also true neurologically speaking. You see, we have mirror neurons in our brain cells that fire both when we act and when we witness others acting. Of course, you see this when you smile at a baby and they smile back. It's also true when another person is angry or sad, that these cells allow you to mirror the pain or sadness as if you were experiencing it yourself. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where we're having a pretty good day, but our spouse or a child or the cashier at checkout seems to be in a bad mood, and all of a sudden our mood darkens as well. Third, I want to share what Richard Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, which is the theoretical framework that I use in my work as a counselor, and was also I'm going to be sharing more about this work, about internal family systems, later in this presentation, but I just want to introduce this again in light of this quote by Joko Beck. So Richard Schwartz calls your partner in any intimate relationship, so again, that could be your spouse, your child, your best friend, calls that person your Tor mentor. So that's TOR-MENTO. And that is she or he, right? Your tormentor, she or he mentors you by tormenting you. Without her or him, you simply wouldn't be able to identify and do the work you need to do in order to heal. So that's a small, short quote with, I think, great impact. And I hope you'll sit with that for a while, too. going forward, I want us to revisit this idea of the brain science behind what's going on with us in our relationship. So what you can see here is Dan Siegel, who's a brain researcher, his handy brain anatomy model. And what he does is he discovered that the fist, a closed fist, could be a very good model for the brain. And if you look at it, you'll see that really, if you look at your whole arm, your wrist is essentially your spinal cord. Then at the base of your palm, that's what he would call the brain stem, or that's the primitive brain that's completely organized around survival. Inside, if you were to open up that fist, the palm area is what he identifies as the limbic brain, or the emotional brain, where all of your emotions reside, free of identifying with time or dates. And then finally, you have the neocortex, or the prefrontal cortex. And this is your fingers that wrap around your thumb there. What this doesn't show you is actually that the thumb is the amygdala, or what he calls the smoke detector. It doesn't know if the smoke is coming from a piece of burnt toast or a raging inferno. It's simply going to alarm all the time and hijack your brain until you take action to calm it. So that's where this other slide comes in. So look at that. When our hand is in that whole brain model, it's in the fist shape, the prefrontal cortex, those are your fingers, are the wise leader of your brain. That's again where your ability to project the consequences of your actions, the ability to find creative solutions to your problems, the ability to access compassion, either for yourself or the other person that you're interacting with, right? But if the amygdala, again, that thumb, that smoke alarm goes off and alarms, what happens is the prefrontal cortex, those fingers fly up. And again, it looks like you flipped your lid. And we've all know what flipping your lid means. We've all had that experience where we're like, I flipped my lid. And what that means neurologically is that you no longer have access to your prefrontal cortex, to those rational thoughts, to that ability to form creative solutions or project the consequences of your actions or access compassion. So again, the amygdala alarms, you flip, you're now acting on instinct, really from the emotional brain where all of your traumatic memories are stored, and then really acting from that primitive brain that's either wired, right, for that fight, flight, freeze. And another aspect that's not on this slide, though, is appease. So think about that. You're feeling threatened, and you will very often fall into one of those categories of fleeing, of fighting, of freezing, or appeasing. So again, it's so important to understand this brain science to really normalize the experience that so many people have when we get upset. So moving on. Let's look at this slide. So when we're whole brain, right, when our whole fist is whole and we have access to all of the areas of our brain, everything is simply easier. We're also able to, again, meet ourselves or others we're in relationship with compassion when we're whole brain. So just think about that again, whether your child is upset or your spouse or that cashier at the checkout line, rather than being so likely to be flipped by your mirror neurons, you're more likely to stay centered and calm, curious and compassionate, right? You can look at that person who is struggling and say, hey, you seem to be upset. Something seems to be going on. What's up? What's going on with you, right? If you've ever had that experience, then you can immediately see the other person also calming down. So again, that's really where we want to live, right? We want to live in that whole brain state. So when we flip our lids, right? Our prefrontal cortex or our rational brains have a very poor connection with the rest of our brain, and we lose our ability to communicate in that calm, connected, and compassionate manner. And that's why it's so important to understand this, because I'm going to share a lot of powerful tools and processes with you in this presentation, but they are absolutely useless to you in that flip state. So again, I just want to normalize this process. If you watch this presentation and then later today or later this week, you flip and you think, oh no, I guess I can't do this. No, of course, this is just a normal biological, neurological response. And what we hope we can do in the future is just getting better at noticing when we're about to flip, because that's where our ability to kind of change the outcome really lies. So if you're in a flip state, quite simply, the best thing you can do is let someone know. And hopefully, because you'll be sharing this information with your loved ones, they will understand. So you'll get in the habit of saying, hey, I can feel myself flipping, or I flipped, and I need to take a break right now. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about how to ensure that we're in a whole brain state when we need to be, right? And that's, again, most of the time. So let's look now more closely at this emotional guidance scale. So the question really is, how do you know when you're flipped or close to flipping? This chart should help. Remember, you can't access any of the tools and processes that I teach if you're on the right side of this chart, because your amygdala has essentially hijacked your brain, right? You're in that fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode. So if you notice that you're on the right side of this chart, right, if you're feeling pessimistic or overwhelmed or disappointed or angry, you only have one job to do, which is nice, right? You don't have to think about what tool to use, what process you need to access. You only have one job, and that is to get back over to the left side, and then you can access the tools and strategies or whatever it is that you want to do next. Simply get back over to the left side and then take action in your relationship. Get back over to the left side and then have the conversation that you need to have with your child or your partner. But stop thinking that you can do anything productive, anything that's going to improve your relationships when your emotions are on the right side of the chart. So remember, when you're on the right side, you only have one job: to feel better. So I work with my clients, and I encourage you to do the same, to make a list. Say 10 ways to feel better right now. For me, that's going for a walk, or petting my dog, or calling a friend, or watching a funny video on YouTube, right? Right now, I'd like you to just press pause on this presentation and write down at least 5 things that you can do to help you feel better immediately, with things that you can do anywhere, anytime. Okay, so now that you have that, we can get to the tools and processes for creating courageous love in all your relationships. And it starts with understanding and appreciating universal needs. Creating a better relationship with yourself and others, and creating courageous love, again, for yourself and others, absolutely hinges on understanding and appreciating universal human needs. And what do universal needs have to do with, say, problem kids and power struggles? So again, so often in my work with families, they've identified that one of their kids is a problem, or they're having power struggles with their children or their spouse, right? They're not unified in their approach to something. So I just want to highlight that understanding and appreciating universal needs allows us to shift our thinking from good and bad judgments to heartfelt communication with ourselves and our children. The crux of the matter is that conflict in any relationship is very often related to unseen and unmet needs. So going forward, let's look at what are some universal human needs. They are, in no particular order, security, novelty/challenge, autonomy, love, connection, significance, growth, and contribution. Generally speaking, no one wants conflict, but is really an invitation to understanding. Understandably, many parents and children want to avoid conflict. Unfortunately, this tends to backfire because often meeting someone else's needs comes at the expense of one's own. So let's look at one of these universal human needs in particular that is very often involved in conflict with other people, and that is the need for autonomy. So whenever we try to make someone else, and this applies to both adults and children, behave in a certain way through demands or threats, we evoke resistance because humans have a universal need for autonomy. This is why demands and threats are almost always met with submission, which then leads to resentment and deadening of spirit, or rebellion, which leads to more anger and violent outbursts. So again, given that understanding, what can we do with that? Right? Again, nobody wants conflict. We're all very conflict averse until or unless, right, we look as conflict as an invitation to understanding, right? So again, there's a different way that engages everyone's needs to have, for example, contribution and cooperation. Our needs, whether met or unmet, are the root of our feelings. So again, the takeaway I want you to have from this slide is that negative feelings or conflict almost always equal unseen and unmet needs. So going forward, I want to introduce you to a very, very important tool, which is nonviolent communication, created by Marshall Rosenberg. And it involves 4 very simple steps. So it involves an observation, a statement of feeling, a statement of needs and or values, and then a positive request. So for example, I'm just going to share an example, a story from my own life, that I ask my son to do something and then he doesn't want to do it. And so he talks back to me, right? So I could say to him, hey, you can't talk to me that way. I'm your mother, right? I know I've heard that a million times. I've said it a million times to my son. But if I were to use nonviolent communication, I would say something like, when I hear you talk back to me, I feel frustrated because I'm needing respect and cooperation. Or, right, using the vocabulary and values, I value feeling significant and cooperation. If you don't want to clean up your room right now, would you be willing to clean it up before dinner? So there's the positive request. This can go a long way in resolving conflict. So quite simply, when we own that our feelings stem from our needs, we are modeling self-leadership and establishing important boundaries. So again, I'm going to be talking about self-leadership. That's a big term in Richard Schwartz's Internal Family Systems a little bit later, but hopefully just having that idea of self-leadership right even now without an introduction into IFS will resonate with you. So again, we're just going to put it all together in this slide so you can have it accessible. And again, it really looks like nonviolent communication in a nutshell. It's either expressing how I'm feeling without blame or criticism of the other, or, and this is really exciting when you can get to this place, it's a little bit more advanced, but definitely attainable, is anticipating another person's needs and or receiving feedback with empathy. Again, that's without hearing whatever they've just said to you with blame or criticism for you, right? Again, we've all had that experience of receiving quote unquote constructive criticism, and it feels like blame or criticism, right? It doesn't often feel good. But if we're using nonviolent communication as a tool, the hope is that we can start hearing that feedback without the blame or criticism. So again, getting back to the first level, which is just expressing how I'm feeling without blame or criticism, it always looks like this, right? When I see, hear, imagine, remember, set event, I feel, again, it's so important to not say think or to not say I feel that, because that often is masking a thought, right? I feel that you should have done that thing, or I feel that you didn't care about me, right? That's not a feeling. It has to have an emotion connected to it. So again, I feel sad, I feel frustrated, I feel hurt, I feel angry, right? Really, that's a really good watchword. People say it all the time, I feel that, and they're actually not expressing an emotion. They're expressing a thought or a strategy. So again, you go to the next step, because I need or value. And again, this is not the time to be sharing your strategy. Very often people will say, because I need you to be better, or I need you to care about me, or I need you to show that you care, right? Again, not the way to do this, right? Because I need to feel significant, or because I value contribution, right? I hope you see that distinction. And then finally, the request. Would you be willing to blank? And again, this is not a demand, and you can tell by the way the person responds whether or not they received it as a demand, because either they will soften and reply in the affirmative, or again, if you get the defensiveness and the stonewalling, well, then you know, gosh, I need to go back to the drawing board with this because I obviously didn't do it right. So the next level, anticipating another person's needs or receiving feedback with empathy, sounds like this. Hey, when you see, hear, imagine, remember, do you feel blank because you need or value blank? And then would you like blank, right? So in this example, it might be, again, my son comes home really upset about something. And so I can say, hey, you look upset. I could just go right to, if I don't know what the context of him being upset, it would be more like, hey, it looks like you're feeling upset. And, do you want to tell me about it, or what's up, right? And then you could go, oh, so when you hear your friends say that you're not good at the game you were playing together, did you feel insignificant, or did you feel hurt? And because you value your friendships, you value your community, you value feeling competent, right? And so would you like to have my support in talking to them about it? Would you, like to do something with me where you can reestablish your feeling of competence, right? Along those lines is very helpful. So, nonviolent communication is a great tool, but truly resolving conflict needs to go much deeper. And now is when we're going to take a deep dive into internal family systems, where his, again, Richard Schwartz's vocabulary is very much around self-compassion and self-leadership. So first, let's talk about the self-compassion piece. So we've all felt it, right? When we haven't felt compassionate for ourselves, that often feels like guilt or shame. And guilt and shame are the stones around many people's necks. When we do something for ourselves, we often feel guilty or ashamed. However, guilt and shame are simply internal judgments that are as violent as any outward judgment of anyone else. So much of our conflict stems from feelings of guilt, shame, obligation, duty, and quote-unquote should thinking. This gives whatever we're doing a certain quality, quite different from when we do things motivated by the joy of contribution. It's also less likely to be appreciated, thus leaving us feeling undervalued and taken for granted. And when we make internal demands like, I should be more understanding of my child or partner, our need for autonomy will often prompt us to resist. So now we can see why blame and shame, when they're often used against us, create so much more conflict within ourselves and, of course, in our most important relationships. So, the ABCs of compassion, again, this is a tool that you can use when you feel yourself getting upset, right? When you're moving over to that right side, or you're there, you find, oh, yep, I'm on the right side of that emotional guidance chart. The ABCs are as follows. A is allow or accept. What is happening simply is. I think one of the hardest things that happens whenever we're in conflict is that we have a thought that this shouldn't be happening. And that, quite frankly, just makes everything so much worse, so much harder. So when we can just accept that, yep, it's not what I want, but this is what's happening right now, we can soften. We will visibly and internally sense the softening. And then B, of course, is breathe. Now take at least 3 deep breaths. This is the equivalent of count to 10, right? That someone you might have heard, like, before you act or react, try to count to 10. It really helps us kind of press the reset button in our brain. So take 3 deep breaths. And then hopefully you've created a little bit of space in that allowing and accepting and in the breathing, where you can actually check in and connect with your feelings and needs. And then you're so much more able to communicate them, right, in the form of that nonviolent communication. So, again, a huge part of creating courageous love is self-compassion. Self-compassion quite simply means we take care of ourselves first, thus making it possible for us to care for others. We've all heard the flight attendant say, put your oxygen mask on first, then help your child or someone else, and with good reason. The upshot is that we often can't give compassion to others if our own needs for compassion have not been met. Remember, we're going to try to communicate to the people in our lives when we feel ourselves flipping. You know what? I'm not in a good place to talk right now. I'll get back to you when I am. So, the next step in our exploration of internal family systems, I want to give you this basic intro. So, internal family system acts from 5 basic assumptions. Number 1 is a person's inner world is subdivided into an unknown number of parts. And we've all had this experience. Richard Schwartz actually developed IFS after 20 years of clinical practice. And what he had noticed is that he would have every one of his clients would come in at some point and say, you know, a part of me blank, right? Like a part of me wants to leave this relationship, but then a part of me wants to stay, or a part of me was just so angry I wanted to scream, right? We've all had that experience, or we have that voice in our head that's telling us something, or our gut is saying something, or our heart, right? We give these parts names sometimes, but what Richard Schwartz does is he really highlights, like, yes, there are an unknown number of parts. We're this vast constellation of parts. And the more that we can name them and befriend them and get to know them and what their needs are, the better we can relate to ourselves and others. So number 2, each person has a self, and that's a self with a capital S. And the self should be the chief agent in coordinating the various parts or the internal family, right? That's how he came up with the name of his system, is that he called this constellation of various parts the internal family. So parts engaging and undesirable, but I would call non-extreme, right? Again, this is for people who do not have medical diagnoses, right? Sometimes the brain is wired in a certain way, or biochemically, neurochemically, they have issues that need to be addressed with medical therapy, whether it's pharmaceuticals, or it could be any number of medical interventions, and those are critical and life-saving many times. This, I just want to be clear, this is a system for parts that are engaging in undesirable yet non-extreme behavior that are trying to communicate unmet needs. So there's our key word again, unmet needs. Fourth, very important, there's no such thing as a bad part, right? They're just parts that have unmet needs and are trying to communicate them. Number 5, adjustments within the internal system result in changes to the external system, right? So again, I really do want to highlight that reorganization of the internal system will probably lead to rapid changes in the roles of all the parts. And again, counseling, what I do, in fact, aims to help the parts express their needs in more desirable and more effective ways. So again, counseling is really a way to fast track this process for anyone who is interested. So now I want to talk about so again, there can be many, many parts, hundreds of parts, thousands of parts within an internal family system, but Richard Schwartz noted that there are generally 3 distinct parts. So number 1, there are the protectors, and they are responsible for maintaining a functioning level of consciousness in daily life by warding off any unwanted or counterproductive interactions, emotions, or experiences resulting from external stimuli. Number 2 are the exiles, and they are most often in a state of pain or trauma, which likely resulted from childhood experiences. Number 3 are firefighters, which serve as a distraction to the mind when exiles break free. So I think the protectors are fairly self-explanatory, but I'll just say that protectors, and I'm going to get it, and I actually have a couple of slides just related to the protectors, so that definition I think holds for right now. I will say about the exiles, the protectors keep these parts, right? The protectors keep the exiles locked away and prevent them from reaching the conscious level with the belief that they must be exiled in order to maintain proper functioning. So again, this is well accepted. I mean, Freud based his psychoanalysis on this belief, right, that we repress parts of ourselves in order to function in the world. So Richard Schwartz, he just calls this something else. The exiles are those repressed parts, if that makes more sense to you. The firefighters are there in order to protect the consciousness from feeling the pain of the exiles. So firefighters prompt a person to act on impulse and engage in behaviors that we often look at as addictive and oftentimes abusive. So think about the firefighters as work, right? Overworking, food, alcohol, drugs, shopping, gaming, sex, right? Again, any of those things that we turn to essentially to numb our emotions from feeling pain and all of, we'll get to the next slide, but I hope that this makes sense to you and is starting to resonate. So the protectors, remember I promised you more slides about the protectors in the next 2. So the protectors often show up as complaints, blame, shame, threats, lies, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, stonewalling, which is ignoring or evading, or gaslighting. And that is, saying something that was in someone's experience somehow wasn't true, somehow belittling that experience. And again, these protectors can show up either as externally focused or even internally focused, right? So the protectors, in order for you to recognize them perhaps a little bit more, the protectors generally say these things. They'll say, I hate you, you're wrong, you're a bad, and again, inserting a more personal noun like mom or dad, the better. You made me feel a negative emotion, it's your fault that, or you always do or say this hurtful thing, or I never get to do what I want. You should want to do X if you cared about X. Like, again, that's one that comes up often in couples counseling. You should want to do this thing if you cared about me, if you cared about my feelings. I hear that a lot and I understand it. So there's the everything always, the nothing ever, or you need to do this thing that you don't want to do, or you won't get to do this thing that you want to do, right? That's often what parents will say to kids. I think we've all heard that, and again, said it ourselves if we're parents. Okay, so getting to self-leadership. Richard Schwartz calls self-leadership the eye in the storm, right? We know that the eye within a hurricane is the calm center within the storm, right? It's just raging chaos outside, but there's always that eye of the storm, the EYE of the storm when we're thinking about hurricanes and tornadoes. But the I that we're looking to cultivate is that capital I in the storm within the model of internal family systems. So the internal family systems model aims to differentiate the self from the other parts, the protectors, the exiles, and firefighters, making up a person's inner world. So the ultimate goal of IFS is to unburden or restore extreme and wounded parts and establish a trusted, healthy, harmonious internal system that is coordinated by the self. So again, that's not saying that bad things aren't going to happen to you or in your experience or in the experience of the people you care about, but you will meet them as this eye in the storm, right? So the hallmarks of self-leadership, which Schwartz calls the 7 C's, are calmness, curiosity, clarity, compassion, confidence, creativity, courage, and connectedness. Doesn't that sound lovely that you could, anything could be happening outside, but you would meet them with these 7 C's? I think that would all feel very different, wouldn't it? So the vital key is speaking for, not from your emotions. Speaking from your anger, you will sound like, stop interrupting me. I've had it with you talking back to me. But speaking for your anger will sound more like that process we learned for nonviolent communication. So it would sound like, when you interrupt me, I feel angry because I need to feel significant. Would you be willing to wait until I finish before you respond? Now, can you feel how different that is and how differently the person you're interacting with might respond in the face of that? Of course, often we're so triggered and reactive that we simply can't press the pause button fast enough to do this process effectively. Again, I call this process simple but not easy. But the beauty, really the miracle of it, is that when you can do it for yourself, you can also lead your partner, that person you're in relationship with, again, whether it's a spouse or a child or a best friend, through it. You can lead them through it as well. And that's where the real breakthroughs in building trust and respect happen. And again, that's what we all want in our relationships. So I'm just going to share with you the self-leadership process. And again, you can take yourself through this. You can take your loved ones through this. Again, it may feel challenging for you to manage all of these steps when you're in the moment of conflict. And so again, you want to make sure that you're taking that break, the ABCs of self-compassion, in order to make sure you're showing up as calm and centered and compassionate and creative as you can. And it's so important that if you feel like feel overwhelmed by this process, that you reach out to a professional, a mental health professional, someone who is versed in internal family systems to help you through this process. But again, I want to leave you with as much as I can. So I am going to share with you the self-leadership process. And it is, when you're triggered, you ask yourself, what am I thinking or feeling right now? Where in or around my body do I find those thoughts or feelings? How do I feel toward the part that's causing me to have those thoughts or feelings? And then are there other parts willing to let me be curious about this part? And what does this part want me to know about itself? What is it afraid would happen if it didn't do this job? How can I express this need in order to get it met? So again, these would be great questions for you to ask yourself and to journal about. I mean, I filled whole notebooks with this process for myself, and I'm also working with a therapist through them. So again, hopefully fast tracking the process. And again, I would love for you to get that support from a therapist as well. So finally, my friends, I just want to share this last quote with you. Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. So I think Brene Brown is now very well known for her work showing that vulnerabilities really are our true strengths. But I was interested and surprised and intrigued, I guess you would say, to find that Sigmund Freud is credited with first talking about how within the context of mental health that your vulnerabilities are your strength. So when I think about that, I think of a question that, again, I often formed when I was going through a crisis. I would think, why is this happening to me? Right? Why is this happening to me? And what I've learned from this process that I've shared with you is that now very often, rather than immediately defaulting to that thought or question, why is this happening to me? I've learned to ask the question, why is this happening for me, right? What is this really? I know this is here to help me. So how can I learn and grow in the face of it? And with that, I'll leave you with my own quote, which is, use your life to discover what needs to be healed and then heal it. Again, I truly believe your life is constantly offering you these opportunities to learn and grow. And I hope that you can embrace this message as well. Finally, I'll just leave with you a slide that thanks you so much for being present with a capital P, right? Bringing your energy, yourself to this presentation. And if you'd like to learn more, you're welcome to contact me. My address is there, the Asheville Family Counseling Center in Asheville. You can call me, you can email me at Stacy@stacycurnow.com. Thank you so much. Take care.